Truly was a tale of two Grizzlies over the weekend. On Friday night, you had the Memphis Grizzlies showing their strength, flexing some muscle against a rival in the Minnesota Timberwolves. And then they followed up that performance on Sunday with a complete Debbie Downer of a day. No John Morant, no Desmond Bane, and the Grizzlies predictably lose with their three best players out. What can we tell of this tale of two Grizzlies? We're going to break that down on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Grizzlies, your first place to come to for Memphis Grizzlies content each and every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much for making us a part of your Memphis Grizzlies experience, whether it is literally anywhere you can get a podcast, whether it is on YouTube, rate, review, subscribe, all of those fun things. Chat us up in the comments. Let us know how we're doing or how I'm doing. Joe Mullinax here, flying solo on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Today's episode for Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks at LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a place in terms of jobs that can help you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. It was a weird weekend for the Memphis Grizzlies as we start off this new week together, looking at what this team is trying to accomplish and trying to decipher how the energy is around the roster. And I'm not going to go too deep into this. I know what you're thinking. Mr. Call Me at Christmas is going to try to make some grandiose statement based off of 2 games in November. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm not going to be hypocritical in that way. But I do think that we saw some interesting threads and things that we're going to all intertwine and interconnect in our final segment of this episode, trying to get a better view, the 30,000 foot view of what the Memphis Grizzlies kind of see themselves as this season. So let's start with the Friday night game on national television. First time that the Minnesota Timberwolves returned to Memphis to take on the Grizzlies since their playoff series last spring. First time that Kyle Anderson has returned to Memphis since he left in free agency. And it was an interesting game in a lot of ways. First off, you had efficient Dillon Brooks show up, and he wasn't especially efficient in terms of his perimeter scoring, which tells you that he was aggressive getting to the basket. He was 9 of 17 overall from the field, but 1 of 6 from 3. So that means he was 8 of 11 from 2. So he was getting his looks, he was getting to the basket, he was getting to his mid-range shot, getting it up in rhythm, that jumper that he likes to do around the elbow. He had some good, strong offensive production, and of course he drew the difficult assignment of defending the best offensive weapon for Minnesota on the perimeter, more often than not, Anthony Edwards, who did have a pretty strong scoring game, but it was really just him and a bunch of other guys, and that's one of the reasons Memphis was able to pull away. So limiting the other guys and finding a way to slow Edwards where they could was kind of the focus of the Grizzlies. So I thought it was a good Dillon Brooks game. Not something that you're always going to see, which we'll talk more about later on in the show. That was one of my first major takeaways from that contest. Another major takeaway for me, all right, and maybe you'll think this is strange. Maybe I'm a bit out there in terms of this one. I liked what I saw from David Roddy. You look at the stat line, and it wasn't overly impressive in just 6 minutes of play, but he looks like he belongs when he's out there. Even though if it's not an extended period of time, he didn't have a chance to really show physically what he was capable of. This was more of a 9-man rotation game, and we'll talk more about that idea later on in the show. But even in his 6 minutes, a lot has been made of Roddy. People asking why isn't, Lofton Jr. getting run instead of Roddy? Why is he somebody that they're continuing to invest in with draft pick capital and all that stuff, making excuses? The kid's going to be fine. As DeMichael and I talked about in our last show together, I think that he's being played out of position, and the time will eventually come. It may not be this season where Roddy gets the chance to be that small ball 5 like a PJ Tucker and can really shine like he did at Colorado State. He's not a 3. He's kind of a 4, and obviously that role will be filled once the team's fully healthy. So I still think, again, 2 made buckets in his 6 minutes of play, grabbed a couple of rebounds. I like what I see from David Roddy. He's going to come along, and he doesn't need to be ready right away, which is a positive. Once this team is healthy, everything will be fine. I haven't mentioned John Morant and Desmond Bane yet because, to be honest with you, they didn't have their best contests. 28 points for Morant, 24 for Bane, but not efficient. Morant, 11 of 25. He had 4 turnovers. Bane was 7 of 16. 4 turnovers, just like Morant. So 8 combined turnovers. They also were in a position where they shot very poorly from 3 combined. Morant and Bane both were a combined 4 of 17. Not their best contests. Now, Morant almost had a triple-double. Some of you are listening to this saying, oh my gosh, really? Ja Morant didn't have his best game. He did in a lot of ways in terms of facilitating offense. 8 assists is nothing to shake a stick at. He grabbed 10 rebounds, helping in that area, of course, for this Grizzlies team is always going to be valuable. But he was not the efficient scorer that the team needed him to be at times to help put this game away. He didn't finish as well as he could have. And he took the open threes that Minnesota was willing to give him. He just didn't convert them. 2 of 10 from beyond the arc, in particular for Ja. That's not going to cut it. And he acknowledged as much in his post-game comments from this one. So credit to Morant, who's always one of his toughest own critics. I was optimistic and positive about what Brandon Clark brought to the table. He feasted on the Minnesota Timberwolves in that series in the spring, and that continued. 6 for 6. Can't argue with that in terms of being an efficient scorer. 3 assists, so showing some of his ability to pass and create, especially in the high post, finding guys that are cutting, slashing to the basket. I really like what Clark brought to this game. They need offensive production, and that is something that he continued to show that he was more than capable of doing in a contest with a team like the Minnesota Timberwolves. So kudos to Mr. Clark for that performance. I was very optimistic going into that contest that the Grizzlies were going to be ready for whatever Minnesota was going to throw at them. Because if you had heard in pre-game comments from others, like Anthony Edwards coming in from Minnesota into the Grizzlies game, they were kind of setting that as a place where this is a barometer for us. We're going to try to turn it around. It's a rivalry. We see this as Memphis maybe bringing out positive energy in us since the Timberwolves have had a less than desirable start going into this season. Not the way that it played out, of course. The Grizzlies did a good job. They won the first quarter, won the second quarter, won the third quarter. The only frame that they lost was the final one, and that was 19-18. So Minnesota was not able to finish things off in any way, shape, or form. I thought that the Grizzlies did a good job spacing things out, building up their offense, hunkering down on defense in the second half, and really committing themselves to trying to play as complete of a game as possible. They haven't had the best start to their season defensively. That has been much discussed and will continue to be, especially for a team that prides itself on the defensive side of the ball. Is Jaren Jackson's eventual return going to be enough to fix what ails Memphis in that area? This game in particular for the Grizzlies was an argument for them being okay long-term. Again, Minnesota shot 47% from the field, 33% from 3. It's not like they were bad offensively, but they also weren't as good as they could have been. The Grizzlies forced turnovers. The Grizzlies grabbed up rebounds, didn't give a ton of second chance opportunities for the Timberwolves. In fact, in terms of offensive rebounding, they only had 7. The Grizzlies had 15 by comparison with Steven Adams on the floor. That shouldn't surprise you. But Adams had 5 offensive rebounds. John Morant had 3. Jake LaRavia had 2. John Conchar had 2. So the reserves, as well as your stars, getting dirty on the glass, that's a good, promising thing to see. So it was a nationally televised game. It was a game that folks were really excited to come out and see what Memphis was going to do against a rival in the Minnesota Timberwolves. And the Grizzlies didn't back down. They didn't flinch. They stood up, and even though it wasn't the best offensive performance from Ja and Desmond, the Grizzlies still found a way to win. That's what you're trying to do, especially with with one of your best 3 players out in Jaren Jackson Jr., and then, of course, a key rotation player in Zaire Williams also not playing this entire season to date. So the Grizzlies did pretty well in terms of this Tale of Two Grizzlies. There was a positive Grizzlies story on Friday. What in the world happened on Sunday? We will talk about that coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's so easy to create a link on LinkedIn Jobs to post a job for free. You add your job, the purple hashtag hiring frame, to your LinkedIn profile, and you spread the word that you are hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's important this time of year to finish strong, and the right team member can help you do just that. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Tale of Two Grizzlies. Positive story of romance, maybe even, depending on how you feel about Desmond Bane or Steven Adams, ooh la la, right? A rom-com, if you will. The love affair that the Grizzlies players clearly have with each other was on full display, positivity. And then they go to Washington, right? The Memphis Grizzlies travel to Washington. They take on the Washington Wizards. And in the injury report on Saturday night, Ja Morant, doubtful. Desmond Bane, doubtful. As soon as that hit, the Grizzlies are punting this game. They were punting the game. And you are likely listening to this and you want to get angry at me. You might get in the comments and say that I'm from South Dakota and I don't know what I'm talking about. And you might allude to the fact that just because John Des didn't play doesn't mean that they're forfeiting or punting or anything of the sort. You're wrong. You're wrong. They're already without Jaren Jackson Jr. They're already out Zaire Williams. If Ja Morant and Desmond Bane do not play in a game, it's different if only one of them sits. They have a chance. If both of them sit, they're not going to win. If they do win, something went horribly wrong for the opponent. And the Washington Wizards, who were down Bradley Beal, they still had Kristaps Porzingis. They still had Kyle Kuzma. They still had guys like Will Barton and Monte Morris and all sorts of players that can create problems for a Grizzlies team, even with Morant and Bane on the floor, much less without them. So the second that I saw that, I said, Taylor Jenkins and company are punting this one. Now, do you want to have an argument that that's the right decision? We'll talk more about that in our final segment. We can have that chat if you really would like to. But don't get it twisted. The Wizards are not a bad team. They're not a great team, but they're not a bad team. They are actively trying to be good. They are not a team that is content with losing. And the Memphis Grizzlies were going into this game without three of their best three players in terms of the top guys on the roster. Morant, Bane, and Jackson, I think we all can agree, are their three best. And then Zaire Williams didn't play. So 4 of their top 8 or 9 guys were out. What did you expect to happen? The Grizzlies to win? That never should have been the case. Again, if they did win, it would have been more the fault of the Wizards than it was the success of the Grizzlies. The best offensive option in this game for the Grizzlies was Dillon Brooks. How do you think that went? If you didn't watch the game, I don't need to read you the stat line. You probably, if you follow the Memphis Grizzlies, have a decent idea of how it went. It didn't go well. It didn't go well. And who would have expected it to? Dillon Brooks isn't supposed to be a number 1 offensive option. That's not what he's designed to do. He's at best your 3rd or 4th option at best. But here's Dillon Brooks taking 22 shots. Dillon Brooks loved it, I'm sure. And Dillon Brooks, to his credit, in fairness to Dillon Brooks, was exactly what the team needed him to be. You know who took the 2nd most shots on the team in this game? Tyus Jones. That's not Tyus Jones's game. It's not anywhere close to it. You know who took the 3rd most shots, 3rd in attempts in this game? My boy David Roddy. 11 points, 5 rebounds, did some good things on the offensive end. Minus 24 in 28 minutes of play. So still has some things to figure out defensively. He had some blown assignments, wasn't able to stick his man consistently. He's a work in progress, but he had to play 28 minutes. He was the 6th man in this game. Jake LaRavia, the other 6th man. The The starters all played at least 28 minutes, and the starters were Santi Aldama, Dillon Brooks, Steven Adams, Tyus Jones, John Conchar. Those were your starters. The next two leaders in minutes were your two first-round rookies, David Roddy and Jake LaRavia. Tell me, be honest, you expected them to win? No, you never should have. It was your mistake if you did. You're looking for good performances like from Santi Aldama, who took advantage of being a more advantageous scorer with Morant and Bane out. 6 of 11 from the field, 3 for 4 from beyond the arc, still grabbed 7 rebounds. Santi looked good. Steven Adams, double-double, 12 points, 10 rebounds, did what he could to help the team. Led the team in plus-minus in this one and +4 in 29 minutes of play. But it wasn't all positive. Brandon Clark, who we just sung his praises of in the previous segment, not as good here. Not as good here. He did not have his game. He was 1 for 7 in this one. Extremely inefficient. As efficient as he was against the Timberwolves, not that against the Wizards. Jake LaRavia, sweet shooting Jake, 1 for 5, 0 for 2 from beyond the arc. The reserves were led by David Roddy in scoring. Again, they're not going to win. That is not a winning basketball team that the Grizzlies put out on the floor against the Washington Wizards, It's not winning basketball. It's not. And the team competed. They didn't lay down. It was a competitive game. Memphis was down 8 entering the fourth quarter. They hung around, but they didn't have the firepower. They went to a gunfight with a butter knife. You're not going to win that duel with the wrong tool. It's just not going to happen for you. So the Grizzlies looked at that game and said, this is one that we need to, for whatever reason, give our guys a breather. Give our top guys a breather. And we went over the numbers from the Minnesota game. You could argue that the Grizzlies won in some ways, not in spite of Morant and Bane, because again, if Ja and Dez don't play, Memphis loses pretty handedly. But there's no denying that they were not themselves, especially from beyond the arc. And because of that lack of efficiency, maybe they saw this as a chance for Memphis to take a breather, to catch a break. They play on Tuesday against the Pelicans, and then they don't play again until Friday. So a 2-day break coming up, one game essentially in 4 days. Monday they're off. Wednesday and Thursday are off. They only play Tuesday in New Orleans against the Pelicans, and then they're off till Friday. So maybe they saw it as a built-in season, catch your breath, get your legs under you. We want to keep you healthy for the entire campaign. And if that was the focus, which we'll talk more about here in a moment, cool. But don't look at this team and say they should have won against the Washington Wizards with the product they put out on the floor, because they shouldn't have. If they had, it would have been an upset. If they had, it would have been the fault of the Wizards in some way. They would have given that game away. The Memphis Grizzlies simply did not have the tools in place to compete. And that's all right. You're not going to win every game. And in an 82-game season, especially with a player like Ja Morant, who plays a style of basketball that is not necessarily conducive to playing 75 to 78 games, when you can find select spots to get these guys rest, it's fair to say that they need a break. But what does that say about where this team sees themselves lining up? What does that say about where the Grizzlies are at this point in November? Not quite at Christmas yet, still trying to see who they are. You hear Desmond Bane talking about guys finding their roles, where they fit, and then you sit Morant and Bane out, and those roles are all crossed again. Dillon Brooks has to be the number one scoring option. Tyus Jones has to be number 2. You have 2 first-round rookies, both taken in the 20s, being key contributors as reserves. What does that do for their role? That's not what they're going to be doing when the team is healthy. So how are they supposed to be comfortable in that way? It's an interesting question, and one that we're going to dive in more as we try to figure out, again, the interconnectedness of these two games, these 2 random games in November. Why are they relevant in the here and now? We'll talk about that in our final segment and trying to make some overarching pre-Christmas determinations off of it. But first, thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen. For your next listen, be sure to check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. This is available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From basketball to football, soccer, esports, we've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can also find those at BetOnline. They're the fastest and easiest way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So what can we take away, right? Let's dive in here. Let's settle in here on YouTube as I stretch it out and roll the shoulders back. Tale of Two Grizzlies. I've been building this up. What are some things we learned from this past weekend? Well, first and foremost, we learned that David Roddy is not going to be in the rotation when this team is healthy, and that's okay. I think David Roddy will benefit a lot from playing alongside Lofton Jr. there in South Haven, which is one of the great ironies of all this, right? People love Kenneth Lofton Jr. They want him to be dressing up with the Grizzlies. He's not ready for it, especially defensively, but people want to see it. David Roddy's not ready for it either, but you know what he's more ready for than Lofton Jr.? Being a malleable, versatile player that can do multiple things in multiple positions. That's why he's there. He won't always be. Once this team is healthy, you will see a lot of David Roddy assigned to the Memphis Hustle, and that's okay. It doesn't make the pick a failure, doesn't make Roddy a guy that they shouldn't have invested in all this time. He is someone who needs to continue to get his game up to speed with the NBA. G League serves as a nice bridge to that, and the Grizzlies do really well developing guys down there in the G League. So I have no problem with that. This is a team that says they are a championship contender. If they're a championship contender, having two rookies in that rotation probably is not simpatico with that concept. So we probably already knew that answer, but again, David Roddy did some good things offensively in particular. He looks like he fits, but on the defensive end, it's just not there yet. He has to adjust to the speed of the game. I think that we learned in these two games that you can always count on Tyus Jones and Dylan Brooks to give you what you need them to give you. Those are two true veteran players in that way. Doesn't mean that they'll always be successful. And I do think there's an important differentiation to make there, a different point that needs to be addressed. Just because they're giving you first and second player offensive shot attempts in the Wizards game doesn't mean that's conducive to winning basketball, right? But I feel like I pick on John Conchar on this podcast. Guess how many threes John Conchar took in 37 minutes of play against the Washington Wizards? 3 threes. Guess who took more threes than him? Santi Aldama. Guess who took the same amount of threes as him? Kennedy Chandler, David Roddy. And Chandler only played 12 minutes. In 25 less minutes of play, Conchar and Chandler had the same amount of three-point attempts. But his usage is going to go up and his shooting percentages are going to go up. That's what I was told. And here's a golden opportunity for John Conchar to go out and be the guy that can shoot that three and help create spacing and make his team better. He did not accept that role. Oh, well, he lets the game come to him. Well, that's not what he can do when he's in that spot. He has to do more. If you want the Grizzlies to win games like that when their best players are not active, John Conchar is part of that key rotation role now. He moves up. He has to contribute. And if he doesn't, is it somebody else's fault? I'm sure it will be to someone out there. But John Conchar needs to shoot more than 3 threes in 37 minutes of play. He has to. He shot 2 threes against the Timberwolves in 23 minutes of play. So let's do the math there. Almost an hour of playing time, 59 minutes, or maybe 60 minutes. Very close. Yeah, 60 minutes of play. 5 attempted threes, and he didn't make a single one. Did not make a single one. That's not enough. Or he made one, 1 3 in 60 minutes of play. It's not good enough. It's not good enough for an 8th or 9th man on the rotation, and it sure as heck isn't good enough for a guy that's playing 37 minutes, leading the team in playing time in a game against Washington. They needed more from him, and he didn't provide it. And you could say that he's down John Conchar, and you shouldn't expect that, but the team is expecting that through their lack of moves that they made by letting Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton, they who shall not be named, walk. At some point, that's going to hurt you. And it hurt them on Sunday. It did. Do they win if Anderson and Melton are here? I'm not saying they do. But if it's Anderson and Melton instead of Conchar playing 37 minutes and Kennedy Chandler, they're in a better position to be competitive. I'm comfortable saying that. I'm confident in saying that. But does that matter in the long run? And I think that's where I'm at. If we're talking about this realistically, in my final takeaway, you have rumors and reports of Jaren Jackson Jr. continuing to ramp up intensity of his workouts. You have Taylor Jenkins saying before the Washington game, Jaren's looking good in his 5-on-5 reps. And as DeMichael has told us on these podcast waves, the last way of cranking things up for guys coming back from injury for these Memphis Grizzlies is 5-on-5 play. So Jaren might be a week or two away from returning. How valuable will it be to have a near 7-foot athlete that can play on the perimeter defensively, that can defend the rim very well, that can shoot the three theoretically? Again, he hasn't been the most effective shooter of late in recent years, but it still will matter so much for this team. There's so much value added for this team to be in a place where they can have him back in the fold, and you want him healthy. And you don't necessarily want or need him healthy in November. You need him ready to play in May and hopefully June. And that's where this Grizzlies team is now. And that's why I don't necessarily care that they punted the game against the Washington Wizards. Both things can be true at the same time, dear listener, dear viewer on YouTube. Both things can be true. They punted the game on Sunday because they didn't play their two best guys. If they had won, it would have been a wondrous, wondrous miracle. Hooray! But that doesn't mean that it happened and it was likely to happen. It was unlikely to happen because their three best dudes weren't on the floor. But Taylor Jenkins, Zach Kleiman, the Grizzlies organization, they don't care about winning games in Washington on a Sunday evening. No. They want to win games in Oakland or San Francisco on a Thursday night on ABC in the Western Conference Finals or on TNT, whoever has those television rights. They're worried about beating the Boston Celtics or Milwaukee Bucks on a Sunday night, game 3 of the finals in Memphis, Tennessee. That's what they care about. That's where the Grizzlies are. And you can argue until the cows come home that they should concern themselves more with regular season results. But I think they've reached the stage where they're more worried about the health and mileage and energy that these guys have to maintain over an 82-game season. They see what's happening with Jaren, the positives of him nearing a return. His return isn't necessarily imminent, but in the next week or two, he should be back on the floor for the Memphis Grizzlies. They want to make sure that a nagging ankle sprain, a nagging issue with a shoulder or a knee doesn't become a larger problem. And is that so wrong for a team that's a title contender, even though they're young, even though they are braggadocious, and even though they're audacious in their celebration after a win against the Timberwolves on a Friday? Their energy and their culture is what it is because of the guys that are on the floor. And you want to make sure that the success that they've had continues because they stay on the floor. So my biggest takeaway from this weekend, dear listener, dear viewer, we saw exactly who the Memphis Grizzlies are if they don't have Desmond Bane and John Morant. They're a bad basketball team, or a mediocre one at best. And if you want the Memphis Grizzlies to be great, you need to do everything in your power to make sure those dudes stay on the floor and are able to enjoy having the 7-foot unicorn back in the fold for the Grizzlies here sooner rather than later. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today. For your second listen today, check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights that only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Next episode, DeMichael and I will be back. Hooray! The dynamic duo resumes things. We'll preview the Grizzlies game against the Pelicans. DeMichael maybe will have an update. I know he's traveling to New Orleans for that contest. Maybe he'll have some new words of insight into where Jaren Jackson Jr. is at. And we'll take a look ahead to a team in New Orleans that has given the Grizzlies problems in the past, but maybe Memphis will be in a better position to compete with them once they're at full strength. And we're assuming that Morant and Bane will be back in the fold. Maybe they won't be. Again, the Grizzlies don't play again until Friday after the game against the Pelicans. Maybe Memphis is seeing this as a chance to only miss 2 games, but to give those guys extended rest. So that injury report will be something that we'll be reacting to on our next episode as well. Thank you so much. However you're taking in Locked On Grizzlies, it's appreciated. Rate, review, subscribe, wherever you get your podcasts on YouTube. It really is so cool to us that you make us part of your Memphis Grizzlies experience. I'm Joe Mullinax. Until next time, stay locked in, Grizzlies fans. This is Locked On Grizzlies.